in a rush, but didn't happen. So we'll get started to keep everything on time, respect everybody's time this evening. For those that don't know me, I'm Bill McKay. It's my pleasure to serve as superintendent of the Governor Mifflin School District. Along tonight with us, we have actually 4 people that will be helping with the presentation tonight. Diane Richards, who's our Chief Financial Officer, will be taking part of the evening. And Kelly Price, who's our Controller, will also have a portion. And Lisa Hess, who's currently our Assistant Superintendent, but in 2 months, I'm pleased to announce, will be the Superintendent of the Governor Mifflin School District. So all 4 of us have a role in what we're sharing this evening. There are questions at the end that have been submitted ahead of time, and we'll certainly answer those questions along with give the big picture of the budget as we progress through the evening. So the first one are just the fast facts. We share these every year. Honestly, they don't change a whole lot year to year. We have 4,138 students as we're here this evening. That fluctuates as we go through every week, goes up, goes down. In all honesty, across the course of years, it stays pretty constant. There's not a big increase or a big decrease, even though we have a lot in and out during the year. As you can see there, almost 50%, a little shy of that, 45% of our students do qualify for free and reduced lunch, which actually does help us out in regards to being able to feed students and some of the pieces that come with the federal lunch program. We have 800 employees, and keep in mind that's all of our employees, full-time, part-time, stipend positions, coaches, teachers, custodians, all of the above. We have about a 100-acre campus, give or take, and of course we have our 6 educational buildings, with the one being way out at Brecknock, which is only 6 miles away, but everyone talks about how it's so far out. About 31,000 residents that have the 5 municipalities with 41 square miles that are our Governor Mifflin School District. This slide, and actually this is another one that doesn't move a whole lot year to year. This gives some of the comparisons to us within the county. So we have 18 school districts within Berks County. We're the 5th largest by student enrollment. We're also the 5th largest by budget. And we're the 8th lowest when it comes to millage rate, so for our school taxes. And we were actually 11th in the budget increase at 2.3%. And our per pupil spending is at a little over $19,000, and that is 17th actually in the county. And there's actually a question as we get towards the end of the presentation this evening that we'll talk a little bit more about that. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly. She's going to talk to you about federal grants, which, if you remember, is a lot of the ARP and ESSER, the American Rescue Plan, the elementary and secondary school emergency relief.
Okay, so we did talk a little bit about this last year. If anybody attended last year, we talked about the start of these. So, all right. So with the federal grants, PDE has specific codes that we use for those. That's how we can keep track of the money, because what we get in is exactly what we spend out on those. So we need to be able to keep track of what we're doing with that in our system to be able to get that out really easily. And then we do quarterly reports on those. Those are basically done to make sure that the amount of money that we're getting for the grants monthly is keeping up with what we're spending on them. So if we would be spending ahead, they would accelerate some of the payments that they're giving to us to make sure that the cash flow is working out there on those. And then at the end of the year, we file final reports on those. So that's where we go in and we let the state and the federal government know exactly what we spend that money on with respect to where we budgeted it and then where we spent it. So the ESSER 2 was $2,045,520 that was allocated to us, and we have until September 30th to spend those funds. So far, this year, we've spent just over 1.1 million, and we will be spent on the entirety of the 2 million now with what we spent last year already. So for those, we spent money on the contract tracing, contracted substitute teachers, instruction, we put some money in there, professional development, lots of COVID supplies. That was the first year. We spent a lot of those funds that first year on those. And operational continuity, that's mostly salaries and benefits for the teachers. So the places that we're still finishing up in this year really is the operational continuity piece. with that. So then the ARP ESSER allocation was $4,137,495. And that, we have until September 30th of 2024 to spend those funds down. Last year, we just started that with about 500,000. This year, it will be almost 3 million that we will spend on those. And the remaining money then will be spent next year. So we'll put some of that into next year's budget as well. And we're looking at some of the similar areas that we spent the other money on, but specifically learning loss recovery programs. So that's really to make sure students are where they need to be. So we put a lot into that, staff helping with that. Social workers, professional development again. There was also a good chunk put to construction on the community center. There were specific requirements for that, so those air quality pieces that were helping with that were able to be put to that project, and operational continuity again. So those are where we spend, and again, the same thing. It's mostly the operational continuity that's going to continue and into next year. And then the ARP ESSER set-asides, these are extra pieces set aside separate from the ESSER funds for specific purposes. So they're even more specific in what they are looking for us to use those funds for. Learning loss, $229,698, summer school and after school. So those pieces are part of what we use the ESSER funds for anyways, but these are extra parts that they've allocated to be used specifically for these pieces. And then a 2.5% set aside for ATSI schools, that's to be used at the high school level, and that's what that piece is there. And again, we've spent just about all of that, and we do intend to have that finished by the end of this year. So there will not be any more spending next year on those pieces. And then the final one that I have in there with respect to the grants, this is actually a state grant, not a federal grant, but this is mental health and physical safety and security grant that we were just awarded. So this is from the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, PCCD, and this was a $327,000 grant, and it had two pieces to it, so it was split in half. So they want us to spend the $163,000 on physical safety and the rest on mental health. And we'll be using those funds next year. So for the physical safety side, we are doing cameras, the GMAP, and intruder locks. And then for the mental health piece, we're putting that into our social workers for that. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Diane now.
All right, good evening. So I'm going to start talking about some of the budget highlights, obviously what we are here for this evening. So this is a real brief, concise summary of what our total budget is for 23-24. So we have total revenue and total expenses. The total expenses are just shy of $80 million for next year, with a deficit of 500,000, which really isn't a deficit, and I'll talk about that. So this is a balanced budget, which does include a $500,000 increase for 23-24. So the reason there's a $500,000 deficit is because we budget a line item in our expenses called budgetary reserve, which is a catch-all expenditure for $500,000 in case there's expenses that we do not count on during the year. And the reason we allow it as a deficit is because since it's unanticipated, we do not know that we're going to spend them. So we do not want to cover that necessarily with revenue, making the taxpayers cover an expense that we don't know whether we're going to spend or not spend. So we allow for a $500,000 deficit budget which is really not a deficit, just to take care of this budgetary reserve line item. So as long as we budget a budgetary reserve, you will have a deficit at least for that budgetary reserve amount. This is a picture of what our total revenue for the district looks like, so that you have an idea of where really is our money coming from. So you will see the maroon, which is obviously the largest section, and you cannot see, I should have done that in white. It is 70%. So the local revenue is 70% of our total revenue. It is obviously our largest piece. And within that local revenue, the largest portion of that is our real estate taxes that we collect. So the two biggest local would be real estate taxes and then also our earned income taxes that come, we get 0.5% of the 1% that anybody who is working pays. The other piece then is state, which is the gray area, that is 28% of our budget. That includes all of the subsidies that we get from the state. And that is a portion, but obviously not our largest portion. Our 70-28% ratio is very common for suburban schools. It is not so common for urban. So urbans actually are going to be flipped, where they get most of their money from the state and less in their local revenue. But for most suburban schools, the 70-28 split is very common and normal. And then 2% of our budgeted revenue is federal programs. And that has decreased from the prior year because, as Kelly just went through, our federal program spending with all of the COVID monies is dying down, and we only have a much smaller portion to spend in 23-24. This then also is just a different way of showing in a graph form the changes over the last 5-6 years of what has happened with our local revenue in gray, the state revenue in maroon, and the gold, which is the federal. So you will see, let's talk about the federal. You'll see in 21-22 and 22-23 how we had upticks in our federal revenue. And that was the extra COVID money that came through. And now in 23-24, there is still about just shy of $700,000 of COVID federal funds in there. The rest are our normal federal programs, all of our title grants, Title I, Title II, Title III, and Title IV. That is going to, in 24-25, be completely title grants, and no longer will there be any additional monies in there for our federal from the COVID. And then you will see the maroon, the state has ticked up slightly. That is good news. Governor Wolf last year, for the current year that we're in, gave us a very healthy increase in our basic ed subsidy. Not as much in our special ed subsidy, but I'll show you that graph later. But he did give us an uptick. And then estimated right now in Governor Shapiro's budget, I have not budgeted his entire ask in his budget. Unfortunately, we do not know yet what is going to get approved of what Governor Shapiro proposed in his budget. What I did put into the budget is half of what Governor Shapiro projected. So until we start hearing more and additional information out of our legislators, we need to be conservative with that number, not knowing what is going to get passed and what is going to get approved. But our state revenue and subsidies are increasing, so that's a very good thing. And then our local, of course, as we've been increasing the last couple of years, $500,000, other than I think the year 2021, right after COVID, we had a flat, and you can actually see that. Budgeted between 1920 and 2021, we had no millage increase coming off of COVID and still being in COVID that year. We did not have a millage increase, but the last 3 years we have had a $500,000. So you will see the slight uptick in our local revenue increasing over those years. Expenditures is the other side of the budget. So this shows you what we call function areas and our large function areas. So obviously the areas that affect the students the most are the bottom two, which are support services and instruction. That is 88% of our entire expenses. Then the other portions are made up of debt, non-instructional services, and other. Instruction is all related to teachers, mostly teachers, benefits that are actually in front of our students, all of the paras, etc. Support services are areas such as administration, operations, IT. Those areas are all deemed support services. But again, in an indirect way, go directly to our students and our campus. Those are the areas, so you will see 88% is spent in those functions for our district. And then this breaks it out by object. So it's the same expenditures, just a different way of summarizing them. And this I compare to prior years' budget so that you can see. Obviously, we are an entity that specializes in educating our students. So obviously that means the largest portion of our expenditures are spent in salaries and benefits. We are a people-run organization, and it is our largest piece. So salaries and benefits account of 67% of our total budget. And then the other pieces are purchase services, supplies, and debt. So you will see the purchase services, most of that is made up of two areas. Our charter school tuition that we must pay for any student who chooses to go to a charter school, and also our tuition for our students who cannot be educated here within the district and need to be placed outside of the district. So we pay tuition to those out-of-district placements, and those two objects would be within that purchase services, that dark orange color, and do incorporate a big chunk of our budget. And then you will see the debt at the top, and then supplies, which is a very small. So relatively from year to year, those expenses have remained fairly consistent. There are not big swings either way in those areas across the expenditure area. As I mentioned previously when I was talking about the subsidies, special education and what we receive from the state has been a message. If you've been to this presentation before, I will continue to show this slide because it is so telling as to what has happened, not only to our district, but to districts across the state in regards to our special ed expenses in total. They have drastically increased from 2014-15 till what we have budgeted in 2023-24. So you will see that is the total of the maroon and the gold together. Those are the total expenses for special education. The gold part shows you what we receive as reimbursement for those expenses from our state and federal government. So we receive special education subsidies from our state, and we receive federal IDEA money from our federal government. Those two combined are the gold column. So from 2014, we received $2.7 million of our total of shy of $9 million. Now we are only receiving 3.7, but our expenses have obviously increased to over 13 million. So it is very telling of how drastic the bars have increased, but how little the state and federal reimbursement has increased in proportion to how much our expenses. So what that means is the local taxpayers picking up those differences when we need to increase our costs for special education, which is very regulated by the state and the federal government. They give us class size ratios that we must follow in regards to how many students that have a special ed label, how many the ratio of student to teacher, etc. So those regulations all cost a lot of money, and those expenses are increasing very drastically. And it has an impact on our budget and where we get that money to fund those programs. So a very telling slide of what's going on. This one is just a different way of showing our special education enrollments versus our expenses. So we'll give you an idea. The blue bar is, so the bars, let's just talk about the bars. The bars have 3 different color codes. The blue code is category 1. Category 1 is broken out for our students based on cost. This is the vast majority of our students, as you can see. These are students that cost us roughly $25,000 per student or less. Category 2 is the orange category at the bottom. These are students that cost anywhere from $25,000 through $51,000. And then category 3 are all students that cost us more than $51,000. So we must report on these to the state government every December. And we fill out a report called an Act 16 report that reports those children by those categories. And that is how the state actually gives us our subsidy. So we receive less subsidy for the students in category 1, more subsidy, they give us a multiplier for category 2, and then a higher multiplier for category 3. So that's what the columns represent. You will see our special ed numbers in total go up and go down, but again, not anything real tremendously. Between the 1,000 mark, we're right below 1,000 for this 2021. So in 2022, I did not get the numbers for this. Came from a software program we use called Forecast 5. So PDE has only posted the 2021 numbers. So we will see what 2022 looks like shortly. So that's what the bars are. So you're gonna see that there's not a huge difference. In those categories, we've remained relatively equal, especially for those category 3, which are most expensive students. We have several students that cost us more than $100,000 per student. So depending on their needs and depending on where they attend, those costs can be very costly. The other lines on top of the bars are actually showing different areas of where the normal special ed. So the red bar is showing the percentage of district enrollment, so that's our enrollment. And then the yellowish green in the middle, that is talking about the regional enrollment of special ed students. So that will show you that over the region that most school districts are experiencing a steady increase in their special ed numbers. And then the blue line at the bottom is actually the state enrollment percentages. So you can see that our percentage is much higher than the state percentage. So unfortunately for our school district, we are experiencing numbers beyond what the overall average is for the state. And then the last thing I'd like to talk about is our general fund balance. Not too long ago, the State Auditor General put out a report on 13 school districts that he targeted for their, what he deemed excessive fund balance. We were not one of those 13, but because that was recent news, we wanted to make sure we talked about what our fund balance is here at the district and where we sit in comparison to some of the our restrictions. So we do have a board policy in place regarding our fund balance. That states that our fund balance must be a minimum of 5% of our expenditures. PDE limits our fund balance to 8%. And our 23-24 budget will be 7.2% of our overall budgeted expenditures. So you can see our 21-22 is our last audit that was done. All the way from there to 23-2014, what has happened with our fund balance. But outside of 2013, 2014, the other years our fund balance has remained fairly consistent. One thing the district does do, if we have excess monies in our general fund, what we do typically do is get the board permission in June to move that money into our capital reserve fund. And this is just our general fund history in our fund balance. It does not encompass our capital reserve fund. But our capital reserve fund is used exclusively for capital purchases and or repairs for the district. So that would cover all of our buildings. It would cover all paving, all roofing, any repairs, any mechanical repairs, large supplies that we would need to purchase vehicles. We do contract out our transportation, but we have several vans that are district owned that we use for sporting events and some of our special ed classes to get to some areas. So those types of expenses would come out of our capital reserve. But we have kept our general fund balance relatively consistent and within all of the required limits that have been set. One locally by the board and then two by the state. So it just gives you a picture of where ours is and what we have sitting and available to us. The other thing to know is like the fund balance, what is a fund balance? The best way to explain it is a fund balance would be equivalent to like a savings account that you might have for your home expenses. So fund balance money should never be used for typical monthly expenses that are going to occur on a regular basis. I tell my board and I tell my administration, fund balance should only ever be spent on one-time expenses because it would be like you assuming that you could pay your mortgage payments out of your savings account versus what your revenue that's coming into your checking account from your paychecks. You would never want to buy a home that you would have to constantly rely on your savings account to make the monthly payment. So fund balance is very similar. So we use it for unexpected expenses. We also use it as a mechanism for cash flow. So depending on when our real estate bills come in, when our subsidies come in, we use the money that is sitting in that reserve to help us, one, earn interest, which right now is over 5% for us with what we're investing in. So that has become extremely helpful in our budget and bringing in additional revenue. And then we also use it ongoing during the year to pay for normal expenses until other revenue comes in. So it is a mechanism that is very important. I will tell you that even the state's minimum or maximum of 8% is very low. The corporate environment would never have a fund balance, theirs isn't called fund balance, but they would never have a reserve of less than 10% in corporate environment. So the restrictions that are put on us are very low. They are not even what corporate standard would be. But we do follow those and we try and keep ours within a relative range that allows us not to have to borrow money to make payroll and other expenses as they come. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the millage. Right here on this slide, you're seeing last year. So you're seeing the average over the county. The countywide average mills is 30.8. So Governor Mifflin there in the maroon, our millage for 22-23 was 29.6. So we were below the average there, and you can see that we're very close to the middle there of what it looks like across the county. You definitely see a bunch of us kind of hovering in that area of that average. And then our estimate for what our 23-24 millage is going to be, well, the average might change, it is still below that average. The next slide here, this talks about total assessment about values across the district. So this is 10-year summary of what our assessment looks like. So you can see right off the bat that right now in 2023, our most recent assessment that we put where our tax bills will be billed at is right now where it was 10 years ago. So all the growth that we've seen through these years has been on a steady downward tick right now. A lot of that is due to appeals. And those appeals are outweighing the growth that we do generally see. You're always going to see new construction and new business and improvements to homes and to property values. But what we are seeing now is a significant amount of appeals that are happening. Those appeals, they're using the common level ratio, which is now at 45%. So that percentage, that's the percentage difference between what your house is selling for and what it's assessed at. So that's a very, very low percentage. So that ratio is there for appeal purposes only, but it takes into account what's happening in the market. So the state tracks all the sale prices of homes to what's their assessment, what are they selling for? and they average that out to see what is going on in the market, and then that's how they set that rate, so that they're saying to you, oh, well, if your property assessment is beyond that, if your assessment, if you take what you could sell your home for, multiply it by that rate, if your assessment is higher than that, that says, well, if you go to the appeal board, they very well might reduce that. So while we see that regularly anyways, it's not a new thing. When it happens on a bigger level, on higher assessed properties, that's where you're really gonna see a huge difference. You know, a regular homeowner, the difference to what we'll see here, that amounts to next to nothing in terms of our assessment. When a large commercial property that's assessed in, you know, the 20 millions, if they go to decide to do that appeal, that can be a very significant decrease to us. And that's really, again, like I said, you're not gonna make that up in what you regularly are having going on in your district. So it's definitely, it is definitely from, if you go from our high in 2019 to down to where we are now, that revenue loss is over 200,000, almost $225,000 loss in revenue simply on what the assessments are in the district. And then here's a breakdown. This is the assessment of the most current assessment by type of what kind of property it is. So obviously, the majority is residential. So that's to be expected if that's our homeowners. And then next beyond that, then you have commercial. Then you have the actually farms, then industrial, apartments, and then industrial. So that's exactly where that 23 assessment number is made up by. And with that, if you compare this to what just last year, the industrial had a $4.5 million decrease. So that's a huge piece there. The commercial decrease was 614,000, and that was another fairly large decrease. And the residential was actually an increase. And again, that's like I was saying before, what's regularly happening in the district, the people doing improvements to their homes that do generate increases in assessments, those types of things, they're outweighing what might happen in an appeal. But you're not seeing that same thing happen in the commercial and industrial. And actually, you know, the numbers I mentioned, these decreases in those areas, those are net. So if you actually look at the actual number that the appeals were singularly, and again, we don't usually look at it in that sense, but singularly, if you look at what the appeal assessment decrease was this year, was $8 million in assessment dollars. So that just shows you how much, and again, it shows how much what regularly happens has to compensate for numbers in that size. So, you know, that's why those areas, it's important to see how that can benefit us. If we do have growth, maybe in the industrial or commercial areas, that can take a little bit away from the share that residents have within what essentially gets built into taxes. The next slide here, this is showing the Act 1 index and the current millage in potential increase of a half mil. So the Act 1 index, that's basically the tax increase that we could do without any kind of special exceptions, without any kind of voter approval. So we could increase taxes 5.2%, increase our millage that high, based on Act 1. So legally we could do that. Our 0.5 increase would be 1.7%. So this year, it tracks what that has looked like, even more than 10 years now. But you can see in recent years, what we could raise taxes to what we are. Obviously, there's a bigger gap there. We're not going to index in these years. And then, so again, as I mentioned, the current proposed budget would have a 0.5 mil increase to taxes, which is 1.7% from last year. And that's what's proposed at this point. And the average assessment in the district, 123,800. So that would be the average assessed home in the district. That's what that assessment is. So that would equate to a yearly increase in taxes over last year of $61.90 or $5.16 monthly. And then if you look at the majority of our assessments, 75% of our district assessments are $150,000, 600 or less. So that would be an annual tax bill of $4,533.06 under the proposed budget, which is a $75.30 increase or $6.28 a month. So if you look at it in that, with that perspective, that monthly number is very small in those terms. I do realize that when your tax bill comes out, it doesn't show you that part of it. But if you put it in your own budget that way, or if you have an escrow account that might be paying those taxes for you, that's the change that's there. So it's not that drastic when you look at it in that sense. And one of the other big things to note here was last year. So last year, as Diane talked about before, with some of Governor Wolf's money that we got, he increased the homestead farmstead allocation that we got. So that money comes to us from the state, and we directly take that off of our approved homeowners tax bills. So those are directly affecting our homeowners who live in their homes. So to be approved for the homestead, you own your home and you live there. That's all you have to do to qualify for that. So that is exactly where then we direct that money. So this past year, we got just over $1 million, which is about $200,000 more than the prior year. So that increased what we were able to give to our homeowners by $34.69. So what you may have seen as an increase on your tax bill last year was reduced by that much if you were approved for homestead. So right now, we don't have that number yet, but I would anticipate there's a good chance it's going to stay under Governor Shuger's budget at that higher amount. But we won't know that until May, so that's released in May for that property tax relief. All right, and that's everything I have, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hess.
Okay, so I'm going to go over a few questions that we received. We asked the community to submit questions that they had for the budget town hall. So the first question is, our school property taxes have steadily risen over the past 15 years, yet the student population is smaller, and a large minority of students are not proficient in math and science per PSSN by grade 8. This obvious excess cost to taxpayers for an inferior product clearly requires remedy. What steps will be taken to shrink the budget and focus on mission-critical educational services, and how will these steps be monitored? So the first thing I have to address is the inferior product. We're educating students. Students aren't our product, and I would never call any one of our children inferior. I'm sure you wouldn't want to have your child called inferior as well. So let me address that right off the bat. We're not creating widgets. These are human beings who come to us at different stages in their education and in their life. And so we need to, differentiate for that, modify for that in how we're educating them. chart will show you that we had a high of 4,285 students in 2009, and then a low of 4,064 students in 2013. So within the last 5 years, 96 students for 12 grades has been the difference. So that's not a huge decrease. So just to give a little education around our enrollment data, we have not had significant drops or significant increases. So things have pretty much stayed steadily, because you're talking 96 students across, well, really 13 grades, K through 12. So that's important to know with that question. The other thing is to note that our math PSXA scores here for last school year are listed up here from Brecknock to Kumru to Mifflin Park, and then Governor Mifflin Intermediate School and the middle school. So the state puts out the proficiency levels, and they also put out an academic growth score, and that's how they rate us. And if you look at all of the different scores for math last year, you'll note that 3 out of 5 schools in Governor Mifflin scored above the state average in proficiency in math. Of course, we can do a lot better, always. But 3 out of 5 scored above the state average, and we're still dealing with the effects of COVID. And so we are faring pretty well across the state. And then 3 out of 5 schools had an academic growth score higher than the state average in math. That means our students are growing who are behind in grade levels, and they're making gains regardless of the fact that they were behind in the first place. So that gives us hope. And like I said, we have work to do. No doubt we have work to do. But truly, we have students who are meeting and exceeding the state average, and we are also doing the same in the academic growth in math. The question talked about science too, which I'm quite not sure why that was the case. Because if you look at our science scores, which only our students in grade 4 and grade 8, that's where they take the science PSSA. And if you look at the data, 4 out of 4 schools scored above the state average in proficiency in science. So we're above all of the students in the state in terms of that. And also 2 out of 4 schools had an academic growth score higher than the state average in science. So yes, there's work to do here, but if we're looking across the state and how we're faring on the same test that all the other students are taking, I think we're doing pretty well. So we'll work to continue to improve those scores as always, but I don't see that the data is showing that we're significantly going down in our scores or our growth. And this is the next question. In view of high cost, poor performance, fewer students, will the next budget provide for common sense cost reductions, including replacing staff pensions with defined contribution plans, 2, increasing pupil-teacher ratio? No other developed nation has a 15-to-1, and yet they outperform us. And this was typed exactly the way it was typed in there, copied and pasted. So number 3, eliminate non-mission critical services such as DEI staff, publicly funded sports teams, and transition from local tax funding to a partial tuition-based system, a user fee in effect, with a backstop for low-income citizens. And this tells me we need to do a little education kind of around what's going on with our state. So, for example, we're talking about pensions. Changing staff pensions is not in the control of the individual school districts. That's at the state level. That's the legislative body that needs to take action on that if anything's going to change. And so that Retirement Act was established and became law on July 18, 1917. And it's been in action since. And it's called the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Public School Employees Retirement System. And it's managed by the board, which is part of the Commonwealth. So individual school districts don't make those decisions. Second, the majority of the governmental school district classrooms have an average of 25 students per teacher, not 15-to-1. And other classrooms, particularly at the high school level, can exceed that. And so, as we know, a student-teacher ratio is not the sole indicator of how well students perform. There are a variety of factors, from poverty to trauma to having special needs to mental health to language barriers. So you can't pinpoint it's because of student-teacher ratio. Like I said before, these aren't widgets, these are human beings, and there are many different factors that come into play. For the third part of the question, the district has never had a diversity, equity, and inclusion staff or administrative position. It doesn't mean that we aren't working on those pieces, but we have not particularly put specific funding towards a director or any of those positions. Our sports teams are part of the whole child experience, which I think we can all agree, whether it's sports or music or other activities, really do benefit our children and are part of the whole education process. And so there is a participation fee of $70 for students who participate in extracurricular activities here at the Government from School District. The Government from School District is a public school and does not have the ability to change from local tax funding to a partial tuition-based system. You can't charge tuition, that's not in the law. So the state legislature, again, is the only body who can make the changes to that current system. And I just recognized as I was going through here, I wanted to go back to the last question. Because the part of that question was, what are we working on for the future in terms of our academic success? In the fall, we put together a group of community members, parents, students, teachers, administrators, board members, to come together to create a comprehensive plan. And these are the goals of the comprehensive plan that we'll be working on from 2023 to 2026. This is all available in more detail on our website. The entire plan is there, including sub-plans that go with it. But I just wanted to note that we are working on some of our PSSA scores, particularly in reading and math, because as you saw in science, we're slowly and steadily, keeping up with the state. So we decided as a community that those were two things we wanted to focus on. So we do have those two in terms of PSSA and scoring on the state assessment test. The other two pieces that the community felt were necessary was to align the career pathways, course offerings, and the district's portrait of a graduate with the career education and work standards. We have the goal of making sure that every student in our district leaves our high school with a plan on going into college or into a career, and we do that through our internship program, through our school to work program, and the many other offerings that we have at the high school. And we also build that throughout pre-K through 12 in our curriculum to ensure that students are following their passions, they know what they like, they know their interests, and they can easily make those choices once they hit the high school. So they have a plan in terms of their scheduling that meets their needs. And then the last one is technology. This is from our students. Our students really ask that our teachers really indulge in professional development that will take their technology use to the next level. And we heard them, we listened to them. So we are going to make sure that all of our teachers have their Google Level 2 certification by the end of 2026. And we're gonna support them in that and help them do that through professional learning. So I apologize that I missed that from the first question, but I definitely wanted to go back and show you that. Once again, our comprehensive plan is on the GMSD website, and you can see it in its entirety. Bill, is that yours? No? Oh, no, it's mine. This is yours?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's an easy way to take it. So this next question, does next year's budget cover the cost of bus aids or monitors for the district? If so, why not? So next year, actually, we have a new transportation provider coming in. They've actually spent the last 2 days onboarding drivers, which was very exciting to see the number of drivers that have been turning out, because over the last few years, that's been difficult. But we have the same number budgeted within our budget for monitors on buses, and everything based on paraprofessionals or aides that are on buses or in classrooms is based on student need. So it's always done through a team decision, and it's based specifically on the need that the student has, whether it has to do with riding the bus or whether it has to be in the classroom. I'm gonna let Lisa come up and take that one, and then I'll take the last two.
All right, my final question from somebody in the community is, how do you know what people value? Know where they spend their time and money. The budget per pupil spending, we're in the 17th, as that was noted earlier in the budget presentation. We're 17th in the county for student spending. and this person says it's disheartening, especially given the high relative budget. What is the district doing to raise per pupil spending? While where the money is spent matters to materialize outcomes, having that money is the first step to offering the district the opportunity to drive those outcomes. Thank you. So number one, per pupil spending is calculated by taking the total budgeted expenditures and dividing by student enrollment. So when it says total budgeted expenditures, that means administration, teachers, staff, everything. So when you hear per pupil spending, you're probably thinking books, pencils, paper, things like that. No, it encompasses everything in terms of expenditures. So to be equal to the first in the county, which is Pocahontas, at $29,855 per student, our overall district expenditure budget would need to increase by $44,689,265. That's a lot of money. And I'm quite sure you don't want us to spend $44 million on increasing administration, staff, teachers, or just buying stuff we don't need, correct? So that is how it's calculated, and you don't want to be thinking it's just those books and pencils and paper when it talks about, you know, the student ratio to our budget. Second, the district has the 5th largest enrollment and the 5th largest budget. To keep all things equal, to obtain the 5th largest spending per pupil in the district would need to increase expenses by $16,478,048 to get to $23,260 per student. And then per pupil spending across the county ranges from $29,855 to $16,707, with government fund at $19,055. So taking all of that into consideration, we are very intentional with our spending and how we spend it in terms of all areas, whether it be hiring administrators, teachers, staff, or how we're spending money on curriculum and supplies. So that is the bottom line of all of that.
So I have the final 2 questions of the evening, and they both have to do with safety, so we've put them together here. These are the questions that keep us up at night. There's no doubt about it. So the first one, why can't we prioritize more of our district budget to prepare our schools in case of an armed intruder? Things like making sure all glass windows, doors are bulletproof, not actual glass, hiring more officers to be inside our buildings the entire length of the school day. Not just arrival and dismissals, seeing as most school shootings happen during school hours, not at arrival or dismissal. And focusing more security on our primary schools, not just secondary. Next question is, when is Smithfield going to put money into more security and safety for our kids, metal detectors, etc.? There is money for a new athletic building, but not for our children's safety. I can assure you we spend a lot of money on safety. So there's a balanced approach to safety, and this is not just Bill McKay speaking. This is, you know, our administrators literally across the year will attend well over a dozen conferences, webinars, and Zoom meetings related to safety. Some led by the county, some led by the state, some by the federal government. So when you look at school safety, there's 2 pieces of it that you want to bring into balance. One is called school hardening, and one are soft solutions. School hardening, as you can see up there, are the things that are like a school police officer, active shooter training, intruder locks, cameras, secure entrances, Raptor systems, keyless entry, those types of things. The other one are soft solutions, which I personally think is a really bad name, but because they're not soft. But soft solutions are things like social workers, trauma-informed professional development, restorative practices, responsive classrooms, student assistance programs. These are the things that build relationships with students and provide support for students. And all of the research that's coming out now, and this includes research from the U.S. Secret Service, shows that those relationships and that support is what makes the huge difference. Everything makes a difference. So I'm not saying that the others do not. They all do. It's a total package. But the most recent studies that have been released over the last year from the Secret Service, one of the studies shows about over 60 school tragedies that were avoided, that were stopped. And in those, they always give credit to the fact of relationships and student support being the indicator that happened. because students were willing to share what they knew with adults in the building, or adults were connected to students and got that information. So it's a combination of those, and we never have enough. So I'm not gonna stand here and tell you tonight that we have enough to keep our schools safe all the time. We're always progressing, we're always adding more things. One of the pieces I put on here was our staff professional development and training. So every year we do building drills with our staff, all of our staff included in those, and most of them have students involved in them. That's about 500 or 600 hours per year that we spend on drills. I'm not gonna put a financial tag on that up here, but you know, if you think about an hourly pay for staff members, from paraprofessionals to teachers, that could be anywhere from $15 an hour to $30 an hour. Act 44 is an act that was put in place by the state. We use a system called vector training that our staff members have to do training. Most of it is related to things like active shooter training, how to stay safe, suicide prevention, those types of topics are what are in there. Everybody must do multiple hours per year with our staff. That equals about 1,400 hours every year that they have to go through those trainings, and that's a yearly. Every single year they're doing those. So that's not one that is like every other year. The next one that's down there is staff professional development. Now this one ranges because some of it is mandated by the state, by the federal government, and some of it is we put in place ourselves as a school district. And it ranges for each staff member from 2 hours a year to 10 hours a year. And it just depends on what cycle they're on, when they were hired. Some of the trainings are done every year. Some are done every other, some are done every third year, some are done every fifth year. So it rarely happens, but you could be a staff member that hit a year where you had 10 hours. Now that probably means for the next couple of years, you only have 1 or 2 hours. But that range from 2 to 10 hours, roughly, if you average it out to our staff, means about 3,450 hours on the average of training they do. All of that related to school safety. So that just gives you an idea of some of the training our staff goes through related to school safety. But we wanted to see some numbers too, so I put some numbers up here. So just recently, and actually Kelly talked about this in the grant section, we received a PCCD grant, a mental health and physical safety grant. It was by the state dictated to us, 50% for mental health, 50% for school security, physical safety. We are spending that money on security cameras, intruder locks within our buildings, and an additional social worker. That's $327,258. One thing I want to note there, that will not cover all the costs of all the internal locks we're putting in. So we will also be using capital reserves. Earlier, Diane talked about the general fund and capital reserve money. We will be covering the difference in capital reserve money to make sure that we can put those internal locks in all of the classrooms, and not just classrooms, but all the doors within our buildings internally. Keyless entry, Raptor system, cameras, radios, those are things we use every year, every day. The cost that I put up there is a $10,000 yearly average. That's just to maintain and keep things running. Software, it's not the startup cost of those things are in place. The startup costs have already been incurred, but these are the yearly maintenance and upgrades in software on average that is spent on those areas. The Student Assistance Program will be one of those soft solutions that I mentioned on the previous slide. That's a program that's in place across our district to support students that are being challenged by a variety of things. Could be trauma, could be social emotional, could be suicidal thoughts, any of those things the Student Assistance Program addresses. It's actually a team of teachers that works with an outside agency and supports those students. And this previous year, we spent $52,250 on that program for our students. School police officer we have, social workers we've added over the last couple of years. We did not have those previously. They've been a huge asset to us. Those 3 positions are $285,000 a year that are spent on those 3 positions. Over the last few years, we've added secure entrances to our buildings. Some of them already had them in place, others did not. That was a considerable expense, but one that was an absolute necessity. The only one that is not finished yet is the middle school. If you've gone into our middle school, you know you don't go into the typical like holding area before you get buzzed into the next section of doors, but that is in phase 3 of our building project. So when phase 3, the next phase of our building project is done, that secure entrance will be added to the middle school. But to look at Brecknock Kumru in the middle school over the last few years and anticipating the middle school within this next year to 18 months, that's $1,268,224 that were spent on the secure entrances. And one last number I put up there, this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. This just gives you an idea across those hardening solutions and those soft solutions. It's student programming. These are some programs, specific programs we have in place. So this isn't all student programming. These are several specific student programs that we have in place that support our more challenging students, students that have been impacted by trauma or other life events, and they tend to have more challenging behaviors, and they need additional support. We could send them outside of our school. We did hear about outside placements and the cost of the district for outside placements, but we do believe when at all possible, the best situation is for those students to stay in our school. So we've created two systems. One is in the elementary grades, one is in the secondary grades that support those students so we can keep them here in our school, but also keep them safe and others safe while doing that. So it's not to say we will not place students outside our school, because we do, but this is a program that has been successful over about the last 5 or 6 years with keeping students in our school and actually transitioning them back to general education in a regular classroom setting. So that gives you an idea of some of the safety. Like I said, it's not a comprehensive list, and we're never done. We're always adding to it. It's a dynamic area. As we learn more, we put more in place. We do constantly have security assessments, where the police come out and do impromptu checks on our buildings. We actually just had one in the last month at the high school and passed with flying colors in regards to, they check for prop doors, where things are parked, locations of items around the school, and we got a very positive report back from the police on that one. So that brings us to the conclusion of this evening. You certainly, this will be posted online. And if any of this brought up any questions, because I know we ask people to submit questions ahead of time, because many times we have to dig in, find numbers, find data to make sure we have accurate information. If tonight's presentation brought up any questions you might have, any follow-up, don't hesitate to reach out to myself, to Lisa, to Diane, or to Kelly. We will absolutely get back to you, whether it's by phone, by email, or our favorite ways to invite you in and have a conversation to answer your question. So I do appreciate your attendance tonight, and everybody have a wonderful evening.